This is Ferdinand de Saussure, the father of structuralism. Structuralists like Ferdinand and Claude Lévi-Strauss believes that our world is constructed through language. So from linguistic and literature, we all knew that language plays an important role in our lives. Language is everywhere, and it is inevitable. There are more than 7,000 different languages exist in the world. Through languages, the exchange of knowledge and information occur, and moreover, our world flourished because of it. You know the Renaissance, the golden age of Islam, you name it. But the question is, how is this exchange of knowledge between all these different languages possible? The answer to this possibility is translation. In 1340, the English word translation coined for the very first time. It derives from the Latin word translatio or transpere, which means to carry over or to bring over. In the field of languages, translation today has several meanings. First, the general subject field or phenomenon, like math, geography, linguistic, you name it. For example, I studied translation at university. The second is the product itself, that is the text that has been translated. For example, they published the Arabic translation of the report. And the third is the process of producing the translation, otherwise known as translating. For example, a translation services. The experts like Peter Newmark, Jeremy Munday, Mona Baker, James Holmes, and Brislin are having different definitions of translation. But in general, translation is a term referring to the translate of thoughts, notions, or ideas from one language to another, whether the language is in written, oral, or sign form. Surprisingly, even though the practice of translation is long established, which has already begun since a long time ago, translation as an academic subject or as a discipline has emerged just only about 60 years old ago. To be exact, it started around in the 1960s, so the translation is still developing. There are several reasons behind how translation flourished rapidly in that time. But obviously, the main reason is that the demand for translation is increasing, of course, related to the economy, politics, academics needs, and so on around the globe. However, at first, translation is not a science. It is not a discipline like today. Many debates occurs between experts and scholars. They try to define what is translation, which is in that time, the notion is still obscure and abstract. But thanks to James Holmes and Gideon theory. Through James Holmes' paper, The Name and Nature of Translation Studies in 1972, now we have a name for our study, which we call the Translation Studies. And because of Gideon Story's remarks on it, that obscurity seems to disappear. Because of Holmes' map translation study, now we have a certain direction. Now we have a clear notion about translation. But wait, before we move on to Holmes' map, now let's talk about Roman Jakobson. At least there are 3 important points to be noted. That is, the 3 types of translation. The first type is Interlingual Translation. The translation within the same language, which can involve rewording or paraphrase. The second is Interlingual Translation, the translation from one language to another. For example, from English into Bahasa Indonesia. And the third, Intersemiotic Translation, the translation from one form or sign into another. For example, a verbal sign into a non-verbal sign, like music, image, or sign language. And now, let's have a look at Holmes' map. This map is emerged in order to answer the 2 main objectives of translation studies. The first objective is to describe the phenomena of translating and translation as they manifest themselves in the world of our experience. And the second is to establish general principles by means of which these phenomena can be explained and predicted. Well, Holmes' map's translation studies are considered to fulfill the requirement to answer those questions. However, At the same time, it gets numerous critics from some experts. So based on the map, translation studies are divided into pure and applied. On the pure side, Holmes talks about the theoretical and descriptive aspect of translation studies. And on the applied side, of course, it talks about how the translation studies applied in the real-world scenario. First thing first, let's talk about the descriptive branch, which famously known as the Descriptive Translation Studies, DTS, or Translation Description. Basically, this branch is trying to describe what translation studies are. There are three main aspects. First, product-oriented DTS, the area of research which describes the existing of translation. One of the main goals of product-oriented DTS might possibly be a general history of translation. The second is function-oriented DTS. It describes the translation function in the recipient's socio-cultural situation. It is more like a contextual study rather than a textual. It concerns where, what, and when something got translated, and what were their influences. And the third is process-oriented DTS. Its orientation is to describe the process or act of translation itself. Describe what happened on the translator's mind when translating. It is more like the analysis of psychological and complex mental processes of translation. The next is the branch of theoretical translation studies or translation theory. Through this branch, basically Holmes is trying to describe, predict, and explain the phenomena of translating and translation using the results of descriptive translation studies in combination with the information available from related fields and disciplines to evolve principles, theories, and models. This branch is divided into general and partial. In brief, the partial theories discuss about the restriction, the boundary, or the scope of what, where, when, and how does the translation occurs. There are 6 partial theories. First, medium-restricted theories. This theory concerns the medium of translation, in another word, who did the translation, whether translation is done by a machine or a human. The second is area-restricted theories. This theory is restricted to a specific language or cultures. For example, the translation only occurred among English and Japanese language and culture. The third is rank-restricted theories. This theory is linguistic theories that have been restricted to a level of a word or sentence. And the next, text type or discourse type restricted theories. This theory dealing with discourse types of genre. For example, literary, business, or technical translation. The next is time-restricted theories, referring to theories and translation limited according to specific time frames and periods. The next is problem-restricted theories, the translation limited to one or more specific problems within the entire area of general translation theory, for example, the equivalency. And now, let's talk about the other theoretical approaches. Like any other disciplines, translation also studied using various theoretical approaches, such as post-colonialism, postmodernism, feminism, deconstruction, Marxism, and etc. Rather than studying notion of equivalence and fluency in translation, theoretical approaches are mainly concerned with investigating the translation related to a specific notion, for example, ideology and socio-cultural. Now let us take post-colonialism as an example. Post-colonial translation studies are mainly concerned with investigating the impact of translation on a colonized source culture and the consequences for a homogenizing or colonizing language culture. This approach makes it possible to break the limitation of purely linguistic approach and allows us to have a broader view of language within the post-colonial text. The approach is better suited for studying marginalized language cultures and their translations such as Euro-African literature. The next example is the feminist translation approach. which is mainly concerned with investigating the impact of translation on social practice, gender issues, and how gender roles are constructed through language and translation. Well, that being said, now let's move on to the branch of Applied Translation Studies. The applied branch of Holmes framework concerns application to the practice of translation. There are three main applications: translator training, translation aids, and translation criticisms. The translator training are applied for teaching methods, testing technique, and curriculum design or planning. So basically, translating is taught in schools, university, and courses to train professional translators. Then the translation aids are applied for three purposes, such as dictionaries and grammar, for expert informants, and IT or technological application, such as machine translator, internet searches like Google, and for an online database. And the last is translation criticism. Translation is applied to review, evaluate, and edit the translation, including the marking of student translation and the reviews of published translation. Translation studies is a field of study that deals with theory, description, and application of translation. Translation is necessary for the spread of information, knowledge, and ideas. It is absolutely necessary for the efficient and effective communication between different cultures. Translation, therefore, is very crucial and critical for the social harmony and peace. As Italo Calvino says, "Without translation, I will be limited to the border of my own country. Translator is my most important ally because they introduce me to the world." My name is Ramadan Saputra, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Ciao.